I have been walking dead worlds for 40 years, and I can tell you this much. They all smell the same inside a suit. Recycled air, the faint mineral bite of the scrubber chemicals, the particular staleness that comes from breathing the same molecules for too many hours. The world outside, whatever it was, whoever built it, whatever catastrophe ended it, comes to you only as light, as shape, as the slow reading of instruments. You feel none of it. You are always slightly removed, slightly behind glass, which is perhaps why I lasted in this work when others didn't. You have to be comfortable never quite touching the thing you're studying. I started at 21, fresh out of the Colonial Academy with a survey qualification and no strong opinions about where I wanted to go. The Colonial office was hearing catalogers, and the pay was adequate, and the work took you to places that had no names yet on most maps, which suited me. I had no strong attachments, no family obligations that would make the long fieldwork deployments difficult, no particular ambitions that required staying in one place. I was a man well suited to the life by temperament, and I found that out in the first year and never looked for a different conclusion. The work was the work. Walk the dead places, instrument them carefully, file accurate reports, move on to the next one. The Colonial Office's mapping of the outer survey region was the project I was part of, and it was a project large enough to last a career, and it lasted mine. Not all of it. The Colonial Office restructured twice and dissolved once before I reached 60. Its survey functions absorbed and deprioritized and eventually mostly abandoned by administrations with other concerns. But by then, I had the habit too deeply to break it. I had the ship and the qualification and the survey archive, and dead worlds don't stop being interesting because the organization studying them loses its funding. Djurkareth had been dead for a long time before anyone put a name to it. The survey charts called it when the Colonial Office first logged it, back when the Colonial Office still had money for things like survey charts and the teams to fill them. That was 30-some years before I got there. By the time my boots came down on the gray flat of the Ashfields, DK7 had been walked by 11 separate survey parties, catalogued to a depth of roughly 400 meters, tagged with 712 individual points of interest, and declared comprehensively exhausted. The Colonial Office had formally closed the file. The last two survey teams had been operating on private contracts, salvage speculators mostly, looking for anything the official surveys had missed that could be pulled and sold. They found nothing worth the fuel cost and said so in their closing reports, which I read 3 times each in the 2 weeks before I landed. I had read all the reports, all 11 sets of them. I had a habit of doing that, reading old survey documents the way some people read novels, looking for the texture of the place between the lines of the data, what each surveyor noticed and what they didn't, what they measured and what they walked past, the shape of their assumptions. Survey reports are not, as a rule, literary documents. They are compressed, depersonalized, written in a vocabulary that values precision over impression and measurement over feeling. But even inside that vocabulary, the person who wrote the report is still there. You learn to find them. You learn to read the way a sentence stretches slightly when the writer saw something that moved them, or the way the language gets clipped and professional at exactly the moment where a less disciplined writer would have stopped and described what they were looking at. You learn to read the gaps. 11 reports, 30 years of intermittent survey, and one thing all of them had in common that took me the better part of 3 readings to fully articulate. None of them had written a single extra word about the anchor. That sounds like a small thing. I want to tell you it's not. In 30 years of survey documentation, the standard procedure produces a certain texture of attention. An unusual geological formation gets a longer description, not because the surveyor was instructed to write more, but because the thing arrested their eye and the language expands to accommodate the arrest. A structure of uncertain function will collect 2 or 3 competing hypotheses in the notes section, because surveyors are problem solvers, and an unanswered question invites speculation. An artifact with an interesting surface will get an image sequence and a paragraph of observation, because the surface detail is data, and data gets recorded. These are professional habits that run below conscious decision-making. They produce, in aggregate, a prose record that has texture and variation, and the fingerprints of actual human attention. The anchor had none of it. In 11 reports, it was described with exactly the minimum required information, dimensions, surface composition to the extent the spectrometers could characterize it, submergence depth, the list of contact protocols that had returned negative results, and nothing more. Not one surveyor had speculated about what it was. Not one had offered a competing hypothesis about its function. Not one had written an extra image sequence or a paragraph of observation that went beyond the instrumental data. What that told me was not that the anchor was boring. It told me that the anchor made people careful, professional, deliberately minimal, that it produced inexperienced surveyors who were fully capable of curiosity and observation, a specific kind of discipline that expressed itself as precisely sufficient documentation. No more, no less. I had spent 40 years reading survey reports. I knew what it looked like when a place made people not look too closely. I was 61 years old and I had nothing left to lose. I landed in the Ashfields on a Tuesday by the ship's calendar, suited up in the bay with the careful ritual of seals and pressure checks and status confirmations, and walked out across the gray flat toward the center of the world. The Ashfields are aptly named. The surface is a fine particulate, not dust, exactly, though it behaves like dust, lifting in low, slow clouds when the wind crosses the flat and settling again with a patience that feels deliberate. The instruments said it was mostly silicate, pulverized stone, the kind of deep geological grinding you get when a world has been geologically quiet for a very long time. Billions of years of slow compression and the occasional distant seismic whisper producing this. A flat gray expanse that stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional emergence of harder rock in low ridges, and at the center of the plain where everything else deferred, the anchor. I had seen the survey photographs. They hadn't prepared me. The photographs were dimensionally accurate. I had calibrated them carefully against the logged measurements, but photographs of very large things in featureless landscapes are always deceptive. Your eye has nothing to anchor scale. You look at a photograph of a mountain and it looks the size of a photograph. The anchor in the photographs had looked like a very large piece of machinery, half-buried, dark, unremarkable in the way that very old industrial things are unremarkable. Functional once, silent now. Standing 60 meters from it, I understood why none of the surveyors had written about what it felt like. It was the wrong size. That's the only way I know to say it. My mind kept trying to resolve it into something it recognized, a building, a ship's hull, a geological formation, and kept failing. The visible portion rose perhaps 60 meters at its highest point, curving inward at the top in a way that suggested it continued underground for much more. The curve was not architectural in any style I could identify. It was functional in the way that a rivet is functional, not designed to be looked at, designed to hold something, to contain it, to keep it from being whatever it would be without the containment. The surface was smooth in the way that ancient worked stone is smooth, not the smoothness of machining but the smoothness of age, of every sharp edge rounded down by time until only the essential shape remains. It was dark, the gray-black of the alloy the reports had struggled to characterize, and in the pale Djurkareth daylight it had almost no reflective surface. It absorbed the light rather than returning it. Standing before it, I had the distinct and irrational sense that I was looking at something that had decided not to be seen, and had mostly succeeded, and that 30 years of survey teams had found it easier not to look than to look at something that looked back at them the wrong way. I set up my instruments at 50 meters and began the standard contact protocol. Power readings, negligible, thermal variance, none, M output, background only, acoustic, nothing. I ran the full suite as every team before me had run it and got the same results every team before me had gotten. The instruments agreed with 30 years of prior instruments. The anchor was inert. I sat down on the gray flat, cross-legged, and looked at it. I want to describe what I was doing, because it isn't what it might look like. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't performing some ritual of connection, some mystical attempt to commune with the ancient structure. I was doing what I had always done when a survey site returned ambiguous data. I was being still, and I was watching, and I was waiting to see what the instruments had missed, because the instruments had been there and gone in a matter of hours, and instruments miss things that take time to see. They miss things that require patience, things that don't happen in a single observation window, things that develop over days, things that are visible only to an eye that has been looking long enough to register the difference between what was and what is now. I had built a career on that patience. It had cost me most of the other things a life is supposed to contain, and I had made that trade without fully understanding that I was making it until it was made, and by then it seemed pointless to reverse it. The wind came across the ash fields in long, slow passes, lifting the particulate in low, pale clouds and setting it down again. The anchor stood in it without reacting. The pale sun tracked across the iron sky. I ate the ration pack I'd brought, drank from the suit's hydration system, checked my battery levels, and stayed. That first day, I sat with it for 6 hours before I walked back to the ship. I noted nothing in the log except that the standard contact protocol had returned negative results consistent with prior surveys. The second day I arrived earlier and stayed longer. 8 hours. I brought a second ration pack. I moved my position 3 times, not because I thought proximity would change the instrument readings, but because I wanted to see the thing from different angles, to let my eye find whatever shape it was trying to hide. The surface up close had a texture I hadn't registered from the photographs, a very fine regular patterning just below the threshold of easy visibility, like the grain in very old stone but too precise for geology. Someone had put it there. Whoever made this thing had put a pattern on its surface, fine enough to be nearly invisible, and that pattern was still there after however many thousands of years it had been half sunk in the gray flat of the ash fields. The lines of the pattern were consistent in width, a hair's breadth, perhaps a millimeter, no more, and they intersected at angles that my eye kept trying to resolve into script and kept failing to. Not because the pattern wasn't script, because it was script in a system I had no reference for, and the mind's attempt to read an unknown alphabet produces a particular frustration, the sense of meaning hovering just outside reach. I ran the imager over a 2 square meter section and tagged the file for later analysis. Then I sat down again, a little closer this time, about 30 meters, and watched the light change on the dark surface as the pale sun moved. I was not expecting anything. I want to be clear about that. I was not in the ash fields because I believed the anchor would respond to me when it had not responded to 30 years of prior surveyors. I was there because I had read 11 sets of reports and none of them had looked long enough, and looking long enough at things was what I knew how to do. That's all. I was doing the only work I had left. The second day I noted nothing new in the log except the surface patterning analysis request, and walked back to the ship in the Jurkareth evening, which is not an evening in the usual sense. The pale sun doesn't so much set as fade, the iron sky shifting to a deeper gray without warmth, the temperature dropping to a point where the suit systems had to work a little harder to maintain comfort. I slept in the ship, woke to the gray light, ate breakfast, and went back. The third day. The third day I arrived at the anchor at what the ship's clock called 6:40, and I sat down at 20 meters, closer than I had been. I had been aware, over the previous 2 days, of something I couldn't instrument, a quality of the site that wasn't data. It is difficult to describe. Survey work trains you to distrust your body's responses to places, because your body is a bad instrument. It finds patterns in noise, reads intention in random process, assigns meaning where there is none. I had spent 40 years learning to filter that signal out and read only what the instruments told me. But on the third day, sitting 20 meters from the anchor in the gray Jurkareth morning, I let the filter drop. Not because I believed my body over the instruments, because I had run out of instrument work to do, and because the thing I was feeling was specific enough and consistent enough across 3 days that it deserved, at minimum, to be acknowledged. The quality I noticed was this: the anchor felt inhabited. Not active, not operational, not dangerous. Inhabited the way a very old building that has been empty for a long time still feels inhabited, because the proportions were made for living in, and the bones of its shape still carry the ghost of that purpose. The anchor felt like something that had been built around something, not as a housing for machinery, but as a casing for something that needed to be kept. That distinction, machinery versus something kept, is not instrumental. My instruments couldn't have told me that, but sitting 20 meters away in the gray morning of the third day, I was as certain of it as I have ever been of anything I couldn't measure. I spent the morning running secondary analyses I had prepped on the ship, angle of submergence calculations, subsurface density estimates from ground-penetrating instrument passes, comparisons of the surface patterning against known precursor writing systems in the survey archive. The patterning comparisons returned no confident match to any cataloged system, though there were structural similarities to the writing found at 3 other precursor sites in the outer colonial survey region. Not the same script, the same family perhaps, the same underlying grammar of how the symbols were built. That kind of similarity doesn't happen by accident. It implies a shared origin, or a shared influence, across whatever distance separated the 3 sites. It implies a civilization that was bigger and more interconnected than the scattered ruins suggested. The subsurface density estimate was the more interesting finding. The structure appeared to extend perhaps 230 meters below the surface, considerably deeper than the prior surveys had calculated, though my equipment was better and I had taken more time with the positioning. At the base of that depth, the instrument was returning an anomalous density reading, a layer that was more dense than the surrounding geology by a margin that couldn't be explained by natural variation. Something was down there that was not geology. I noted all of this and sat in the gray quiet of the third day morning, watching the pale light move on the dark surface, and at midday I ate my ration pack and did the thing I have never been fully able to explain or justify. I talked to it. I want to be clear that I knew, rationally, that this was not productive survey behavior. I knew the anchor was almost certainly inert. I knew that addressing a dormant alien structure in a voice that the Jurkareth atmosphere would absorb in a few meters anyway. I was speaking through the suit's external speaker, which produced 40 decibels at the surface under optimal conditions, and the gray flat of the ash fields was not optimal conditions, was not a methodologically defensible action. I knew all of this, I did it anyway. I told it how long it had been logged. Roughly 30 years of official survey, plus the unknown interval before that, which the archival comparisons and the geological strata put somewhere north of 40,000 years. I told it about the 11 teams. I told it about the colonial office's closed file and the salvage speculators who found nothing worth the fuel cost. I told it about the gray flat and the iron sky and the quality of the Jurkareth light, which struck me as a particularly lonely kind of light. Not dark, not dramatic, just pale and consistent and indifferent. The light of a star that had been shining on an empty world for a very long time without anyone to notice. I said, I have read every report and no one stayed long enough. I don't know what's inside you, or what you were built to guard, or whether you're waiting for someone specific or just waiting. But I came a long way to sit here, and I don't have anywhere pressing to be. And if there's something you've been holding that needs to be held by someone else for a while, I'm willing to hear about it. The wind came across the ash fields in a long, slow pass. The gray particulate lifted and settled. The anchor did not respond. I sat there for another 2 hours, watching the pale sun track across the iron sky, and then I went back to the ship, filed my daily log, and went to sleep. I should have left the next morning. By any reasonable professional reckoning, I had been on site long enough. 3 days of negative contact results, exhaustive instrument coverage, no data the prior 11 teams hadn't already collected. The rational decision was to pack the equipment, lift out of the ash fields, file the updated survey report, and move on. The survey habit, the same momentum that had moved 11 teams from the anchor to the next point of interest, was available to me in exactly the same way it had been available to them. Instead, I set my alarm for 500 and went back. The 4th day was different from the first 3 in a way I registered before I could have told you what the difference was. The gray light was the same. The wind was the same. The anchor looked exactly as it had looked every other morning, enormous, dark, absorbing the pale Jur-Karath dawn rather than returning it. My instruments, running their automated start-of-day pass, were returning the same baseline readings they had returned every morning. Negligible power, no thermal variance, background M only. The data said nothing had changed. But when I was approximately 40 meters out, I stopped walking. I had stopped without deciding to stop. My body had registered something before my mind caught up, and that something was this. The ground was different, not dramatically, not in any way I could have pointed to and said there, that changed. But the particulate under my boots was behaving differently than it had on the 3 previous mornings. Settling differently. The long, slow clouds the wind lifted having a slightly different character, as if something below the surface was interrupting the usual pattern of the gray flat in a way too subtle for the eye to catch directly, but not too subtle to register in the aggregate of 40 years of dead world walking. I stood at 40 meters for a long moment before I moved again, not from hesitation, from the particular professional habit of documenting the observation before acting on it, so the record would show the sequence correctly. I noted in the log that the surface particulate behavior was anomalous relative to the prior 3 days, and that I was attributing the anomaly to possible subsurface change rather than wind pattern variation, and that I was running a ground-penetrating pass to characterize the change before proceeding to closer observation. That was the professional version. The honest version was that I was standing 40 meters from something that had been completely inert for 30 years, and was now, faintly and below all but the most careful reading, not inert, and the 40 years of dead world walking had put something in my body that recognized the difference between a dead place and a place that was in the process of becoming something else. I stood at 40 meters and ran a ground-penetrating instrument pass. The anomalous density reading at depth had changed. The layer that had been sitting at roughly 230 meters of depth was now at 219, 11 meters, in a structure that had been registering a consistent depth across 30 years of survey. An 11-meter vertical shift in a single day was not instrument error. It was not geological settling. Something below the anchor had moved. I stood at 40 meters and breathed the recycled air of my suit and looked at the dark surface of the thing that had not responded to any of 11 survey teams across 30 years, and I was aware that my hands were completely still. That surprised me. I am not a courageous person in any dramatic sense. I am a careful one, which is different, and which has kept me alive through 4 decades of dead world work precisely, because I don't mistake the absence of alarm for the absence of risk. What I felt standing at 40 meters looking at an 11-meter vertical anomaly was not bravery. It was a very particular kind of quiet that I recognized from other moments across 40 years. The specific attentiveness that arrives when something very large and very true has begun to happen in front of you, and your whole body knows it and stops making any other demands. I walked forward. I brought my instruments to 15 meters and ran a full contact sweep. Power readings, not negligible. Something now faint but unmistakable. A low-level power signature in a frequency band that had previously returned background only. The signal was not large. But it was there, and it had not been there on any prior reading, not in 30 years of prior survey, and not in my own 3 days of observation. Thermal variance, a tenth of a degree difference on the center section of the visible surface. Against the ambient temperature of the Djurkarev gray flat, a tenth of a degree was significant. Output. I stayed with this reading for a full minute before I logged it, checking the instrument calibration twice, because I wanted to be certain before I committed the observation to the record. The anchor was producing a very faint, very regular electromagnetic pulse. The periodicity was 8.3 seconds, even and consistent. In the rhythmic vocabulary of autonomous systems, that pattern had a name. It had the character of a heartbeat. I sat down at 15 meters with my instrument array, and I watched the surface of the anchor, and I did not move for a very long time. The surface patterning I had imaged on the second day, the fine regular texture just below the threshold of easy visibility, was clearer now. Not because the pattern had changed, because the surface itself had changed. The dark alloy that had absorbed all light for 3 days was doing something different now, and what it was doing was this. In the center section, a region perhaps 20 meters across and 10 meters high, the surface was translucent, not transparent, not glowing. Translucent, the way old glass is translucent, letting light through without letting you see clearly through it, giving you depth without giving you resolution. And from within that translucency, there was an interior space, a depth, a suggestion of something behind the surface that was no longer entirely hidden from view. I noted all of this in the log. I kept my voice steady, which took a small effort and which I did not note in the log. The 8.3-second vibration was running. The power signature was stable, not increasing. The thermal differential was holding. Nothing was escalating. Nothing was alarming. Whatever was happening inside the anchor was happening with great deliberateness, slowly, carefully, as if the process it was engaged in was one it had done before and knew the proper pace of, and the proper pace was not fast. Was, in fact, specifically not fast. As if it knew that what it was waking toward required care in the approach, that rushing the approach would be wrong in a way that wasn't merely tactical. I ate my ration pack at 15 meters. I drank from the hydration system. I checked my battery levels and noted my estimated return time, and then I settled in and watched the translucent section of the surface, and I waited. The Djurkarev sun tracked across the iron sky. The wind moved across the ash fields. The gray particulate lifted in its long, slow clouds and settled again. At what the ship's clock called 1347, the vibration arrived. Not through the suit's external acoustic sensors. Not through the air. The Djurkarev atmosphere was too thin and too chemically wrong for that. It arrived through the suit itself, through the frame, through the structural members that distributed load and transmitted force across the whole garment. A low, slow vibration, barely above the threshold of detection, with a periodicity that matched the pulse exactly, 8.3 seconds. As if the pulse and the vibration were the same message read by different instruments. As if the anchor had found a channel into my suit that didn't require the world outside to cooperate. My suit's seismic sensors logged the vibration at a magnitude consistent with very deep, very localized subsurface movement. The subsurface depth had shifted again, 211 meters now, down from 219. The anomaly was rising. The translucent section of the surface had grown. It was now perhaps 35 meters across and 15 meters high. I moved closer. I became aware of this when I checked my position against the anchor's measured profile and found myself at 8 meters. 8 meters from the surface of a structure, the size of a warship's hull that had been registering a heartbeat since 7:30 that morning, and was now producing visible changes on its surface and subsurface movement at depth. I noted this in the log with the same careful precision I applied to everything else. I noted that I had assessed the proximity as acceptable given the non-escalatory and controlled character of the changes in progress. That was accurate. It also did not convey what it felt like to be at 8 meters. What it felt like was this: I was standing in the presence of something that was becoming aware of me. Not becoming active, not coming online in the way that a machine comes online, the escalating power curves, the rapid state changes, the functional urgency of a system returning to operation after a shutdown. What was happening in the anchor was not a restart. It was something much older and much slower. The way a very old person wakes from a very deep sleep, not with the snap of the young, but with the gradual, deliberate reassembly of themselves from somewhere far down, each layer coming back in sequence, each faculty returning in its proper order. The surface patterning was illuminating now, not all at once in slow sequence, beginning at the base of the visible section and moving upward, fine lines of pale light tracing the precursor script from the ground up, filling in the hairsbreadth lines of the unknown alphabet the way water fills the channels it knows. The light was pale, not white, not gold, something between the two that didn't have a standard color name in my vocabulary. It was the color of old illumination, the color of something lit for a very long time. I watched the light fill the patterning, and I did not move. The sequence took a long time. I'm not certain how long. I stopped checking the clock at some point and simply watched. What I was watching was a script I could not read being written in light across the surface of a structure that had been dark for 40,000 years, and the quality of attention it required was total. Not analysis. I was not running recognition algorithms or attempting interpretation. I was watching in the way you watch a thing you know you will only see once, in the way you watch a thing that is doing what it was made to do and doing it correctly and completely, so that the watching itself is a form of respect. The precursor civilization that had made the anchor had designed the illumination sequence to be seen. It was meant to be witnessed. I witnessed it. Through the transparency in the surface, now roughly 8 meters across and almost fully clear, I could see the interior of the anchor. Fully lit now in that same pale between color, the interior space was larger than I had estimated from the outside. The structure's internal dimensions didn't correspond to its external profile in the straightforward way of human-built objects. The precursor engineers had done something with the interior geometry that my instruments had not caught. The space was deeper than it appeared, and at the center of that deep lit space, clearly visible through the transparency, was what I had been half expecting since the second day: a vessel. The word sarcophagus is imprecise, but it's the best word I have. 30 meters from end to end, perhaps 12 meters across at the widest point, with the elongated form and tapered ends and slight convexity of a lid designed to be lifted. Not a human scale. Something that had never been built for human dimensions. Built for something considerably larger, something that would need 30 meters of length and 12 of width to be properly contained. Its surface was dark, darker than the anchor's alloy, with a different texture, not the fine patterning of the outer shell but a smooth, almost liquid surface, the kind of surface that has been polished by age past the point of having grain. It was sealed completely. No seam I could identify from my position. No hinge, no lock, no access port. Just the sealed shape of the thing, resting in its cradle in the interior light, having been there for longer than my instruments could confidently measure. The illuminated patterning on the outer surface reached the top of the visible section. A moment of stillness. 3 seconds, 5. The M pulse continuing its 8.3-second beat. The frame vibration continuing to match it. The wind across the ash fields lifting the gray particulate in its long, slow pass. And then the anchor spoke to me. Not through the suit's audio systems. Not through the external speakers. The resonance that had been building in the suit's frame since 1347 modulated, changed character without changing channel. And what arrived was not vibration in the structural sense, but something the suit systems classified as infrasonic, and which my body received not as sound but as presence. A frequency that was below hearing and above silence, that arrived in the chest and the jaw and the hollow places of the skull and organized itself, somehow, into language. Into words. 5 of them. I want to tell you that I had been prepared for something. That 40 years of Dead World survey had produced in me a professional equanimity sufficient to receive what I received without reaction. That would not be true. What happened when the 5 words arrived was that I became, for approximately 30 seconds, unable to do anything at all. Not thought, not response, not documentation. I was a man sitting 8 meters from a structure 40,000 years old on a dead world under an iron sky, and something very old and very deliberate had just addressed me. And for 30 seconds the fact of that was the only thing in the world, and there was nowhere for it to go. The 30 seconds passed. The M-pulse continued at 8.3 seconds. The frame vibration continued to match it. The pale light in the surface patterning held steady. Nothing in the anchor's behavior indicated that the transmission of the 5 words had changed anything for the structure. It was not waiting for a response, not escalating, not doing anything it hadn't been doing before. It had said the thing it needed to say. The transfer had been made. The anchor was returning to its Vigil state, the only difference being that the Vigil had a new second party now, and the new second party was sitting cross-legged on the gray flat at 8 meters trying to remember how to breathe. I breathed. I made myself note that I was breathing. I made myself note the time, 14:12 by the ship's clock, and the duration of the transmission and the physical characteristics of the delivery medium, and the exact text of the 5 words, which I had no trouble reproducing because they were not the kind of words that are easy to misremember. They were the kind of words that stay. The 5 words were, "Dustwalker, the Vigil is yours." They were not a greeting. They were not a question. They were a statement of transfer, the specific, formal language of a handoff, a custody transaction, the kind of words used when one party is passing something of weight to another party and wants no ambiguity about what has been passed and to whom. The anchor had not said hello. It had not said who I was or offered any explanation or context. It had said the thing it had been waiting to say, the thing it had been holding in its structure for 40,000 years, waiting for the specific conditions that would allow it to be said. And the specific conditions, as far as I could reconstruct them from the available data, were this. Someone had to sit with it for 3 days and come back a 4th time for no professionally justifiable reason. That was it. That was the whole protocol, not genetic lineage, not military rank, not species or origin or any measurable quality of person. Just 3 days negative results came back anyway. I sat at 8 meters and breathed the recycled air of my suit and thought about the 11 teams that had come before me. Thought about their reports, the clean professional language, the negative contact results, the moved on. Thought about how each of them had done exactly the rational professional thing, which is to allocate your observation time efficiently and not spend resources on a site that is not returning value. I had done the same thing for 3 days. The difference in the end was the 4th morning. It was the alarm I set for 500 when there was no professional reason to set it. It was the habit I had never been able to break, the specific incapacity for declaring something finished before it felt finished. Dustwalker. I had been walking dead worlds alone for 2 years, since the colonial office dissolved. Filing reports no one was reading, cataloging things no one was paying to catalog, living in the ship, eating ration packs, walking gray flats under iron skis, reading old survey documents in the evenings because they were what I knew how to read. Not because I thought it was producing anything. Not because I had a plan or a goal or an expectation. Because stopping felt like agreeing that it was over, and I could not make myself agree. Dustwalker was the most accurate description of my life that anyone had ever offered me, including myself. The Vigil is yours. A transfer of custody. Specific and formal, not an invitation, not a possibility, not a question of whether I wanted the Vigil or felt qualified for it. It was mine. The phrasing allowed no ambiguity about that. Whatever had been standing watch inside the anchor, Whatever intelligence or process or encoded purpose had maintained itself for 40,000 years in the gray flat of the ash fields, pulsing at 8.3 seconds through geological time, waiting for the conditions that would allow the transfer, had found those conditions and made the transfer. Done. Concluded. The vigil, whatever its nature and whatever its object, had passed. I started talking into the log. My voice, when I heard it played back later that evening, was the voice I use when an unexpected instrument reading requires immediate documentation before the moment passes, precise, careful, slightly flattened, entirely professional. I noted the 5-word transmission. I noted the delivery medium and its character. I noted the power signature, which had stabilized at a level the instruments could now characterize as long-duration standby generation. The kind of power budget you build into something you intend to run without maintenance for an indefinite period. The kind of power you build into something you are going to leave. I sat with the log running, and I thought about what the transfer required of me. The vessel in the interior had not opened. The anchor had communicated through its outer structure without revealing what was inside. I had a title and a statement of custody and very little else. I did not know what the vigil was over. I did not know what was buried beneath the anchor at depth. The anomalous density reading that had been rising through the day, now at roughly 208 meters, now at 204, slowly and without urgency, as if whatever was at the bottom of that measurement was also reorienting itself after a very long time in one position. I had a responsibility I could not yet fully characterize because the thing I was responsible for was still largely underground and still largely sealed. But I understood enough. A civilization that builds a 40,000-year guardian structure and equips it with a succession protocol has thought carefully about the long term, has understood at the level of engineering that civilizations end, that the builders will be gone before the vigil is over, and has built for that gap, has designed the succession not around specific bloodlines or species markers or measurable qualities that might not persist across millennia, but around a behavioral pattern, a habit of attention, a specific inability to walk away from an unresolved thing. That is not a military criterion. It is not a genetic one or a political one. It is the criterion of a patient civilization handing off to a stubborn one, of builders who understood that the next guardian wouldn't come from strength or power, but from the specific quality of a species that keeps cataloging dead worlds for 2 years after the organization that paid for the cataloging has dissolved. That keeps sitting with inert structures after 3 days of negative contact results. That sets an alarm for 500 on the morning. There is no professional justification for doing so. I had passed a test I hadn't known existed by doing the only thing I had ever known how to do. The gray flat stretched to the horizon under the iron sky. The wind moved across the ash fields. In the interior light visible through the transparency in the anchor's surface, the enormous vessel rested in its cradle, unchanged, its lid sealed. The M-pulse continued at 8.3 seconds. The illuminated patterning on the outer shell held its steady pale light. I pulled up my instrument array and began a new survey. Not the contact protocol, a site characterization survey, systematic mapping of the structure's full subsurface extent, the anomalous density reading and its rate of movement, the power signature's detailed frequency characteristics, the surface patterning's illumination sequence, and whether it encoded information in the order of illumination as well as in the symbol forms themselves. The kind of survey you do when you are planning to stay. When the site has stopped being an investigation and become something else, a place you are responsible for. It took most of the remaining daylight. I let myself work with the focused, methodical pleasure that good survey work produces, the pleasure of understanding a thing better than you did before, even when you are a long way from understanding it completely. The pale Jur-Kareth sun tracked toward the deeper gray of evening. I checked my battery levels, calculated my return time, kept working until the last reasonable moment. When I finally walked back to the ship, The anchor stood behind me the way it had stood every evening, enormous, dark, enormous in a way the photographs had not conveyed. But the surface patterning was still illuminated faintly, a tracery of pale lines visible in the evening dimness. Not fatting, holding, as if something inside had woken and was attending to the world it had been sealed away from for 40,000 years and was in no hurry to stop attending. I filed my evening log in the ship, ate dinner without tasting it, and sat at the small table in the ship's cabin with the survey data for a long time. The subsurface anomaly had stabilized by the time I lifted off the instruments, settled at roughly 200 meters of depth, no longer rising. Whatever had moved had reached the position it intended to reach, and was still. Something below the anchor was present and oriented and waiting, and I did not have the equipment to tell me more than that. I stayed up late. I didn't intend to, it wasn't productive, and 40 years of fieldwork have made me practical about rest, but I found I couldn't sleep, and sitting at the small table with the lamp low, and the data on the screen was better than lying in the bunk staring at the ceiling of the ship. So I sat, and I thought, and I let myself think about things I don't usually let myself think about in the field. I thought about the nature of a 40,000-year vigil. Not abstractly, concretely, in engineering terms, in terms of what you actually have to build to make that work. The power budget alone is staggering. The kind of autonomous system that can maintain monitoring functions and a succession protocol for 40,000 years without external maintenance or input is not something any current civilization could build. It implies material science that doesn't exist yet. Control systems designed for geological timescales. A power source that has been running since before the oldest human civilization, before writing, before agriculture, before anything that could be called a record, and running reliably enough that when the specific conditions of the succession protocol were finally met, the system still had enough reserves to perform the transfer, to illuminate the surface, to transmit the 5 words. Whatever built this had understood their own impermanence clearly enough to engineer around it, had understood that they would not be there to hand the vigil off personally, had understood that the successor guardian would be from a different species, a species they couldn't fully characterize in advance, and had designed the succession protocol accordingly, with criteria that would survive the translation across civilization gaps. Not specific bloodlines, not measurable biological markers. A behavioral pattern, a habit. The habit of sitting with difficult things until they resolve. I thought about the 11 survey teams, moving through the ash fields at survey pace, measuring what could be measured in a single shift, moving on. I thought about the colonial office's closed file. I thought about the shape of 30 years of careful professional documentation that didn't have a single extra word in it, because the anchor had made the surveyors careful without any of them knowing why they were being careful. I thought about what it costs to stay. Not dramatically, not in the sense of danger or sacrifice, though the dead worlds have their costs and I have paid some of them. In the simple, daily sense of what it costs to be the person who sits with the unresolved thing instead of filing it under a sufficient category and moving to the next point of interest. That cost is small, day by day. A ration pack, a charged battery, the alarm set for 500. Accumulated over 40 years, it is not small. It is everything, all the things you didn't do, all the places you didn't go, all the reasons to stop that you found yourself unable to accept. I had paid that cost across 4 decades and 100 dead worlds, and I had not known I was paying toward anything. I had thought I was just a man who couldn't quit, who had a habit he couldn't break, who kept cataloging things no one was paying him to catalog, because the work was the thing he knew how to do, and he didn't know how to live without it. The vigil was mine. I slept better that night than I had slept in months. What that says about me, I leave to others to decide. In the morning, I went back. The anchor's surface patterning was fully lit in the gray Jurkarith dawn, fully, steadily, every line of the precursor script carrying its pale between-color light without variation. Not the faint trace of the previous evening. A complete and consistent illumination, as if the system that maintained it had determined its proper operating level overnight and settled there. The transparency in the center section was holding, the interior visible and lit, the vessel in its cradle unchanged. The M-pulse continuing at 8.3 seconds, regular as the gray wind. I set up at 8 meters and began the work I had planned the previous evening, and then I kept working, that day and the days after. I have been back to Djurkareth 7 times in the 3 years since. The Colonial Survey Authority, restructured again, with different priorities, some of which now include precursor sites of potential significance, has a file on the anchor that I have been building since that 4th day, and it is now the most comprehensive survey of a precursor structure in the active archive. 3 dedicated research teams have set up facilities in the ash fields. There are 12 people on site at any given time, suited and working, running instruments, trying to understand what is below the anchor and what the vessel in its interior is, and what civilization built it, and for what purpose, and what the succession protocol was designed to protect. I am not the lead researcher on any of those teams. I am not a researcher at all, technically. I am a survey cataloguer, which is what I have always been. My role on the site is what it has always been, to walk the gray flat and sit with the unresolved things and come back when reason says to leave. That is the role the succession protocol was looking for. It is the role I will keep. The anchor responds differently to me than to the research teams. Not dramatically, it doesn't open further for me, doesn't reveal more than it has already revealed, doesn't transmit additional words. But when I am on site, the M-pulse rate shifts slightly, from 8.3 seconds to 8.1. A change the instruments register and the teams have filed as statistically significant. The surface patterning maintains a slightly higher luminosity when I'm within 50 meters than when I'm farther out, as if the structure is tracking the difference between its warden and everyone else, and finding the warden's presence worth noting. I don't know what's beneath the anchor. None of us do. The subsurface surveys have mapped a sealed chamber at approximately 200 meters depth, irregular in shape, of significant volume. The density anomaly has been stable since that 4th day. It shifted and settled and has not moved again. Whatever moved, moved in response to the transfer, and has been still since, as if it has settled into a new position and is content to wait there. I have a theory about what it is. I keep it out of the official log, because it isn't instrumental and I have spent 40 years learning not to trust my intuitions into the record. What I will say is this. A civilization that built a guardian structure with a 40,000-year power budget and a succession protocol for identifying a new warden was not a civilization that guarded things carelessly. The engineering implies an object of significant importance. The succession protocol implies an object they couldn't take with them when they left and couldn't risk leaving unwatched, something that had to stay in the ground, something that had to be kept. I walk the ash fields when I'm on site, which is most mornings. I walk in the gray dawn light before the research teams begin their day, in the low quiet before the instrument arrays and the log transmissions and the careful technical conversations start up. My suit systems running quietly, the wind coming across the flat in its long, slow passes, lifting the particulate and setting it down. My boots on the gray surface, 4 decades of dead world walking still in the knees and the shoulders, and the particular way I hold my weight over uncertain ground. The walk from the research facility to the anchor takes 11 minutes at my pace. I know that because I have timed it without meaning to. The body learns the routes it travels regularly and internalizes them. 11 minutes across the gray flat, in the low pale light, with the anchor growing from a dark shape on the horizon to the thing it actually is. I have made that walk more times than I can count now. It is not a commute. It is the work itself, the moving through a dead world with attention, the arrival at the place that is your responsibility, the checking in. The Vigil has a morning practice. I have learned it by doing it. The anchor stands at the center of the plane, and the surface patterning illuminates when I approach, not all at once, But in that same slow sequence I watched on the fourth day, the precursor script filling from the base up, as if the structure is performing a greeting it has standardized. As if it recognizes the specific rhythm of my approach and responds in kind. There are mornings when I stand at 8 meters from the surface in the gray light, and I think about the civilization that built this. What they must have known, to build a guardian for 40,000 years and design the succession around a behavioral test. What they must have understood about patience, that the long watch is not held by the strong or the qualified or the powerful, but by whoever cannot make themselves agree that the thing is finished before it is finished. Whoever keeps coming back. They had thought about what kind of successor would still exist after 40,000 years. They had thought about what qualities persist across that kind of time, through the end of one civilization and the beginning of another, and the various restructurings in between. They had concluded, apparently, that stubbornness persists, that the specific inability to stop persists. That across whatever changes a species undergoes in 40 millennia, there will still be someone who sets an alarm for 500 when there is no reason to, and goes back. I had been that person on 100 dead worlds without knowing it mattered, without knowing that the mattering was the point. The 5 words arrived once. I don't expect them again. The transfer has been made and acknowledged, and the structure doesn't repeat what it has already said. The 8.1 second pulse continues its beat, and the surface patterning holds its steady pale light, and somewhere 200 meters beneath me, in the sealed dark of the chamber the teams have mapped but cannot yet reach, something waits. The thing the anchor was built to guard. The thing the vigil is over. I don't know what it is. But 40,000 years ago, a civilization that was running out of time built something to keep watching over it, and built into that something the capacity to find the next watcher, and built into that capacity the understanding that the next watcher would be recognized not by who they were, but by what they couldn't stop doing. The gray flat stretches to the horizon. The wind moves across the ash fields. The anchor stands at the center of the world it was built to guard, patient beyond any patience I can properly conceive, pulsing its slow, steady beat into the Jur-Karath stone. I sit at 8 meters in the gray dawn and I watch. That's the work. It has always been the work. It always will be.